The definition of the term Wendigo is a key part of the oral traditions of the indigenous people of North America, and well, that's where we first find our first problem, because as we will quickly find, there are many different ways to portray the word Wendigo. In the Ojibwe language, it is the Wendigo. In the language of the Algonquin people, it is Wajigo. In the Cree, it is the Wikitau. And in the Proto-Algonquin of the Algic, it is Wi Nakato Wa, which most likely translated to owl in their original language. And this is where it is difficult to pinpoint the exact origin of the concept, or whether there even was an origin point, and the Wendigo instead emerged into the psyche of the indigenous people of North America through a shared sense of moral obligation, or even stranger still, the same shared experiences. That though is pure speculation, but interestingly enough, there is a similar word, the Wachuge, that depicts a similar being that appears in the legends of the Athabascan people of the Northwest Pacific coast. You see, much like the Wendigo, the Wachuge is a man-eating creature that devours flesh as a curse and eternal punishment. But interestingly, the Wachuge of legend is instead inexplicably tied to the creation mythos of a specific group of Athabascan people, the Danija, which roughly translate to those who live among the beaver, who believe that in their mythology the Wachuge was a person who would become possessed or overwhelmed by the power of one of the ancient giant spirit animals that form the basis of their oral tradition. In most instances, the Wachuge is depicted as a creature formed of ice and can only be killed by being thrown into a campfire and kept there overnight until it has melted. In some instances, however, this creature is even depicted as having wings, a rare occurrence in the traditions of North American legend and a symbol of great importance. Whichever depiction of the Wendigo myth we take though, one thing is for certain. In the traditional belief systems of the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Cree, the Naskapi, the Innu, and many other Algonquin-speaking peoples of North America, the Wendigo is far more than just a cautionary tale told to children over a campfire. It is an integral part of their complex belief system, and in most cases it served as a taboo reinforcement, both a reminder and a warning of the hardships faced through winter. No matter which depiction of the myth we pull apart, in each of them the Wendigo is seen as the embodiment of gluttony and greed, particularly in relation to the unbreakable taboo of cannibalism. It is a cultural cornerstone, a warning sign of excess in consumption, and the creature that would later form these warning signs would become the embodiment of that. Now, that is not to say that the depiction of the Wendigo was always the same. In some cases, particularly in regard to Ojibwe and Cree lore, the Wendigo was often described as a giant creature, many times larger than a human being, a differing characteristic that was absent from other Wendigo myths of Algonquin culture. In these legends, whenever a Wendigo would consume another person, it would grow larger in proportion to the meal it had just eaten, preventing it from ever sating its own hunger. It always wanted more, never sated or content with its quarry. That's an important lesson for all of us to learn, I think. But still, this led to the garish and oftentimes terrifying description of this creature that would later become the driving force behind its evolution from the 20th century onwards, particularly when we analyse its depiction in modern horror fiction. As Basil H. Johnson, an Ojibwe teacher and scholar from Ontario, described in his 1995 book The Manitous, the Spirit World of the Ojibwe, the Wendigo was gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones. With its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets, the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, unclean and suffering from suppuration of the flesh. The Wendigo gave off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption. And this is where the modern depiction of the Wendigo gained traction as an entity of horror fiction. The Wendigo is terrifying, a humanoid, supernatural creature that exemplified an eternal hunger. And as European settlers made their way through North America and the colonial period of the continent began to tighten its grip around this ancient culture, the modern interpretation of the Wendigo was born. And not only that, but as science and psychology came face to face with ancient oral traditions, the exact concept of the Wendigo's cultural purpose became something else entirely. Wendigo psychosis, a historical phenomenon that is perhaps the reason why the Wendigo myth was so successful in later North American literature. In 1661, as a chronicler and missionary for the Jesuit relations made their way through North America, they came across the first documented account of Wendigo psychosis as a result of a reported case of desperation and cannibalism. As he explained, the men that he came across were afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but a combination of all of these species of disease, which affects their imaginations and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily, the more they eat. Whatever the interpretation of this report, it was an important moment in the later cultural significance of the Wendigo, particularly with its relation as a genuine concern for the rough and often inhospitable periods in colonial North American history. Now, the Wendigo was far more than just a creature in a far-off land, but instead a very real hardship faced in winter as the inexperienced fur trappers and settlers pushed further into the New World, hearing tales from the indigenous peoples of the land who had grew to fear it over many generations. However, one of the more famous cases of Wendigo psychosis came several hundred years later with the tale of a Plains Cree trapper named Swiftrunner. During the harsh winter of 1878, Swiftrunner and his family were stranded and starving in the wilderness of Saskatchewan. Soon, despite being 25 miles away from an emergency food cache of the Hudson's Bay Company, Swiftrunner's eldest son perished, and shortly afterward, Swiftrunner allegedly butchered and ate his wife and 5 remaining children. The case was both strange and shocking, and given that the Plains Cree trapper resorted to cannibalism in such close proximity to the emergency cache, it was later revealed that Swiftrunner's actions were not the case of pure cannibalism as a dark and last resort to starvation, but rather of a man afflicted by Wendigo psychosis. And here was the inspiration for the first and very important fictional interpretation of the Wendigo myth, with a short story written by Algernon Blackwood, a tale written in the year 1910 simply titled The Wendigo, the first mainstream horror depiction of its kind. In the story, Blackwood tells the tale of 2 Scotsmen on a moose hunting trip in the wilderness of Rat Portage in northwest Ontario. They are joined on their trip by 2 guides, a man named Hank Davis and the French Canuck Joseph Defargo, alongside their native cook, a man named Punk. Although this tale is a very tame brush with the Wendigo myth of legend compared to most modern incarnations, it instead employed the first depiction of the Wendigo not just as a grotesque entity, but instead as a doppelganger which could take on the guise of a human being. Perhaps the most important convention of this story, though, is with the wisdom of the native character Punk, who recognizes all of the signs of the Wendigo and immediately gets the hell out of camp. Whatever its importance to the mainstream horror depiction of the Wendigo, Algernon Blackwood's story planted the seed of an idea in many other horror writers of the time. It would influence authors such as Howard Phillips Lovecraft and Grace Isabel Colburn, and most importantly, Auguste Derleth, who would use the concept of the Wendigo in his story, The Thing That Walked on the Wind, and later with his Cthulhu mythos entity, Ithaqua, which some of you may be familiar with. Hint, it's a giant Wendigo-looking ice revenant that roams the Arctic wastes. Sound familiar? Yeah. It would also go on to inspire an early short story of Thomas Pynchon's titled Mortality and Mercy in Vienna, first published in 1959. Here it focused on a character developing Wendigo psychosis and his development then into a psychotic serial killer. That in itself would later inspire several movies such as 1999's Ravenous, as well as several TV series such as Charmed and more recently Hannibal. Perhaps the most iconic of the modern Wendigo, though, is with Stephen King's version of the entity. As we briefly explained in our opening clip, it would inspire a key character in King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary, where the personification of evil in an ancient burial ground of the Micmac people was an ugly, grinning creature with yellow-grey eyes, its ears replaced by ram's horns, and its tongue pointed, decaying, and yellowed. Although not as profound as it is now, at the time, King's interpretation of the Wendigo, which in turn was an interpretation of the 19th century colonial legends coming from North America, set the template for the Wendigo's later portrayal in popular horror culture, where for the most part it completely replaced the Native American lore that had long formed the importance of the Wendigo. In 2012 though, Chippewa author Louise Erdrich had a thing or two to say about that with her novel The Roundhouse, setting the precedent for the new reinterpretation of the Wendigo myth. And here is where our path splits, because the Wendigo in many ways explains the transformation of one land to the other. For thousands of years the Wendigo served as a cultural barometer for the Algonquian people, an ever-adapting tale that formed the importance of cooperation, of restraint, of sustainability, and the dangers that came with forsaking those virtues. It painted the monster that we all ran the risk of becoming if we indulged too much in the act of greed. You see, as colonial North America expanded into these ancient territories and these settlers shifted away from the many European folktales that had formed the basis of their society, new ones were forged, fragments of a culture that had long existed before them as they clambered to produce some sort of an identity. Whilst this identity has been interpreted in many differing ways, perhaps in most cases to their detriment, the essence behind the myth of the Wendigo has always remained the same. Be it man or monster, we all choose which side we fall on.
Coming in number 5, we've got the Stalker Challenge. Right on, you might hear that name and think it's one thing, but it's actually probably not the first conclusion your mind lands upon. The Stalker Challenge isn't about following someone around or testing a pal's skills at going unnoticed in the dark. It's actually a reference to a popular PC game called Stalker, where players explore an alternate reality Chernobyl exclusion zone. A lot of folks praise it for its lonesome and isolated atmosphere and the more realistic gunplay. Plenty of online military enthusiasts, survivalists, and Tarkovsky fans enjoy the game, so when we say that this Wendigo sighting was a result of the Stalker Challenge, we can probably assume the writer was a fan of Stalker and wanted to experience living life solo in the wastelands for a while. During this temporary hermitage, he worked his way into the middle of nowhere with nothing but some vodka, guns, and a harmonica. Like a true survivalist, he hunted some small game, made a meal of it, and explored the surrounding area. Snacking on the rabbit he'd hunted, he heard some rustling coming from the bushes, but didn't think anything of it. The next day, he was startled awake by some screaming. Weird, especially considering how far he was from civilization. Grabbing his rifle, he went off in the direction of the scream. It didn't seem to come from one singular location, and eventually the writer got lost. After a long day wandering around, he found his way back to the camp he'd set up, but now somebody else was there. There was a humanoid form in tattered clothes staring down at his fire pit, unmoving. Worried that this person might be injured, the writer called out to him. No response. After a few minutes of standing there staring at him, he again asked if he was alright. The humanoid figure turned to him and said, "I wouldn't worry about it." This set off alarm bells for the writer, who began to back away. At that point, the humanoid mentioned that he could go for another meal right now, prompting the writer to book it out of there. Hearing the humanoid running behind him, he turned around and shot blindly, apparently finding his mark. The creature screamed, the same scream from earlier, and seemingly disappeared. The writer eventually made it to the road and encountered a car. He didn't look back. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Nebraskan Wendigo. If you weren't already wary of traveling alone in Nebraska, now you've got a whole new reason. That's right, a new spooky story of someone's close encounter with a third kind. Maybe not an alien, but hey. This tale comes from a guy who was a farmhand when he was younger. One night, the farmer he worked for asked if he could figure out who was trampling all the corn stalks at night. Excited to take on guard duty, the farmhand stayed up to see if he could catch the culprit. Armed with the farmer's shotgun and the advice not to shoot unless absolutely necessary, he hung out in a lawn chair and walked around the field a few times. Eventually, he heard rustling from within the cornfield, followed by what sounded like giggling children. This, of course, was the most unsettling moment of the farmhand's entire life. Not wanting to hurt kids, but also not wanting to get children of the corned, he brandished his gun and told them to leave unless they were looking for trouble. The giggling stopped and the rest of the night went smoothly. However, the next morning the farmer discovered something a little more disturbing than trampled corn. His cow, which had been left in the barn, was totally exsanguinated. All the blood in this animal was removed somehow and didn't leave any on the floors. The farmer called the cops and somehow managed to land on the explanation that it was some idiot kids, but the farmhand didn't quite buy that. However, the following night both the farmer and the farmhand stayed up to see if they could find anyone. The farmhand, sitting in his chair again, heard the giggling once more. This time he asked whoever it was to reveal himself, prompting a gigantic humanoid creature with antlers to shuffle out of the field. Bad call, to be honest. The farmhand shot at the beast and began to run away. During his flight, he was tripped by a gopher hole and fell to the ground hard. Suddenly it was morning and the farmhand was back inside the house, surrounded by the farmer's family. The farmer had told the cops that he was attacked by some random guy, but he chased him off. However, afterwards, the farmer took the farmhand aside and told him that he saw the beast too. It was on all fours after the boy tripped, and it took 6 shots from his rifle to scare it off. From then on, they didn't go out after dusk, and they kept guns on them at all times around the farm. Coming in at number 3, we've got a Nevadan Wendigo. Not Nebraska, Nevada. This is a different tale, although curiously enough, the protagonist of this story is the same age as the protagonist of our farmhand extravaganza. Funny how that works. While exploring some abandoned mine shafts, great idea I know, this lad felt as if he was being watched. Moving right along, he eventually encountered some old abandoned cabins. After looking through, he found a well, and this well stunk to high heaven, a strange, acrid, coppery smell, sort of a mix between fresh blood, rotten meat, and pennies. Not wanting to be around it anymore, he decided to head back towards the mine shafts. However, when he did, he saw something crouching inside of one. At first, he thought it was a mountain lion, as he'd seen them around these parts before, but then he realized how big the thing crouching in the shaft was. The openings were usually 8 to 10 feet tall, and this thing couldn't stand up straight inside of it. It moved towards the opening, revealing a bunch of matted brownish fur, and then it screamed. The kind of scream that haunts your dreams until the end of your life. Our explorer pal felt his blood go cold and immediately shot at this creature with his rifle. A few rounds to the torso did nothing to stop it, however, and it continued to scream. Time to run. He scrambled away, jumping over fallen trees and occasionally turning back to fire quick pot shots and check if it was close. Eventually he made it back to his truck and hightailed it out of there, averaging 60 miles per hour. He drove without stopping until he got home where his dad was waiting. His dad asked him how the trip went and where he ended up, noticing that his son was quite shaken. When our mineshaft exploring storyteller explained to his dad where he'd been, his dad appeared concerned and told him to never go back to that location. They didn't talk about it again. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Allegheny Forest Encounter. As I find more and more of these stories, I realize how absolutely terrifying the forest can be. Did I realize this as a kid when I went camping, or when I decided to go way off track while visiting remote cottages? Probably not, but I'm still here, right? This story comes from a hunter and his seasoned outdoorsman buddy. They'd gone fishing in the woods and made sure to prepare adequately. Black bears around that area, so they had their guns with them. After encountering a mangled deer corpse, they were a little unsettled. However, they chalked it up to a bear or maybe some coyotes and kept moving. A little while later, something set off the buddy's spidey senses and he asked for his gun. Moving to the middle of the creek, they saw a bear running through the woods full tilt. It was followed pretty closely by a deer headed in the same direction. But why would a deer be chasing a bear? Well, it wouldn't. Something was chasing both of these creatures, something huge. From afar it looked like a massive deer with superimposing antlers, but as it ran, it noticed the two hunters and moved towards them. When it got up close, they realized that it had a huge maw full of teeth that could only be described as belonging to a carnivore. That was all the warning they needed. Shooting at the beast while running away, they made sure to put as much distance between them and it as possible. Eventually they made it to a plateau where nothing seemed to be wrong. Reloading their weapons and looking around for any sign of trouble, they realized they were in the clear. Miles from their base camp, they hiked all the way back on high alert but never encountered the creature again. Even now, they have no idea what the hell they ran into. And at number 1, we've got another farm experience. This one doesn't stem from working on a farm though, it stems from living on one. When the writer was about 13, he and some friends lived in a rural area and would often get together to goof around in the woods. Meeting at one friend's farm, they chased each other around with sticks for a little while. However, our narrator ran off and stumbled upon a dead deer with some limbs missing. This led to the discovery of a bunch of dismembered animal parts strewn about the entrance to the woods. At that point, most of the friends went back to the farmhouse, while our fearless storyteller and a couple more pals went to investigate. This expedition resulted in the discovery of a dead cow with missing ribs, broken legs, and a head picked clean of soft tissue. Yuck. That was it for the night and everyone got home safe. About a week later though, while hanging out near his house, the storyteller heard what he thought was his dog. Thinking it would rush out of the bush and beg for a treat, he wandered in the direction the noise was coming from, but what came out of the bush was not his dog. It was a shambling abomination, walking around like a newborn doe, covered in viscera with teeth as sharp as knives. Needless to say, he ran right inside. That night, while gripping a baseball bat in bed, he heard an awful scratching upon the wall outside his room. As this happened, his dog started freaking out, barking at the back door. Our storyteller rushed downstairs and grabbed the dog, double checking that his door was locked, and he stayed up all night listening for more. The noises eventually subsided and dawn broke. In the morning light, he peeked outside the door and saw an assortment of pig's feet strewn about the porch. Yikes. Coming in at number 5, we've got a Nevadan Escapade. This story comes from a self-proclaimed survivalist living in Nevada. They open up the tale with a bit of a disclaimer, saying that they never really believed in the paranormal before this happened. In fact, prior to experiencing this, they would have assumed that anything strange going on would likely be the result of government experiments and the like. There was absolutely no way they expected an experience like the one I'm about to summarize. So the survivalist had a couple weeks of vacation saved up and didn't want to let it roll over to the next year. Taking that time off, he didn't really know what to do with himself. After a day of doing nothing, he decided to go camping on his own, as none of his friends were able to take any time off. Away he went, packing some basic supplies and grabbing coffee and donuts on the way out. After setting up camp in the middle of nowhere, the survivalist decided to have a little vodka and do some target shooting. Following an encounter with a jackrabbit, he came across a freshly killed coyote. Seeing as hunting coyotes is relatively common practice in Nevada, he didn't think much of it, but he still saw the way the body was left as strange. Weird smell, too. That evening, while scanning through some capped channels on his ham radio, the survivalist came across something odd. Knowing that there was military presence in the area, he wasn't too surprised to hear the sounds of gunfire coming through the speaker. However, these war game sounds were followed up by what he described as nails on a chalkboard and a blood-curdling scream. Immediately after hearing these noises, the radio crapped out. Uh-oh. Reassuring himself that whatever happened there was hundreds of miles away, he went to bed. The next day, while puttering about, he wandered into a fenced-off military area, letting him know that whatever those noises were last night, they were probably closer than he assumed. Exploring this area more, he came across a cave that piqued his interest. Heading inside, he didn't notice anything odd at first, but soon became attuned to a very particular rotting smell. The same smell he noticed when coming across the oddly killed coyote. This tipped something off in his head and he got the hell out of there. At that point, the survivalist was terrified. Returning to his camp, he found that it had been raided. Everything was torn up, tossed about, and emptied, and nothing was missing though. While checking on his equipment, he noticed that all of these sounds in the area had stopped, dead quiet as night fell. And that's when he saw it. A humanoid creature standing off to the side, looking straight at him with dark voids for eyes. Hell, it even looked like it cracked a little smile. The survivalist tried to shoot it, but his bullets didn't seem to do anything but piss it off, making it scream in an ungodly fashion. Seeing that his weapon wasn't doing much, he booked it out of there and found a crevice to hide out in until sunrise. And when the sun rose, he got the hell out of there, ASAP. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Forest Ranger. Being a forest ranger must be fascinating, right? Out in the wilderness all day, every day, minimal human contact, keeping an eye on the local flora and fauna, occasionally taking part in rescues, maybe helping a lost hiker find their way, wearing a cool hat. What a life. Of course, it isn't all fun and games. There are plenty of harrowing situations one can find themselves in when deep in the forest. However, mythical monsters don't usually come up during job training, so you better watch out. Take this tale from a forest ranger somewhere in the States. While responding to a missing persons report, they found themselves in a tricky area of the hiking trail. At some point it splits, with one of the paths leading people deeper into the forest instead of back to the service area. Naturally, the ranger called for some backup, and about a half hour later his backup showed up. Ranger and backup head off into the woods, calling out for the missing person, but to no avail. And when they got to the split in the path, Mr. Backup disappeared too. Trying for a while to contact the missing backup on their walkie, the ranger got a little spooked. Then, when all hope seemed to be lost, he ran into someone matching the description of the original missing person. However, this individual didn't respond to anything the ranger said to them. The ranger took the person back to their truck and told them to wait in the back while he went to look for his backup again. At this point, his backup chimed in on the walkie, saying that he'd found the missing hiker at the bottom of a hill with a broken leg and would be returning with him soon, which didn't line up with what he had seen. The ranger went back to the truck and saw that it was empty, with the passenger door wide open and the cage inside bent out of shape. Apparently that kind of stuff had been happening for a while too. Folks hearing their neighbors calling out in the night when they knew their neighbors were on vacation, or perhaps hearing their dog barking outside when the dog was at the foot of their bed. Coming in at number 3, we've got a deep woods discovery. There's nothing quite like having your expectations subverted, yeah? I don't want to spoil too much of this story before I tell it, so here we go. I found this one in green text format, and it seems to be coming from a person living in a rural area. Every year, they find that hiking in the wooded area near their home is quite pleasant in the fall, so they head out to do just that. However, they seem to find some of the more overgrown areas unsettling. Makes sense, especially if you're far away from society at large. As they explore a little more, they notice something dive into the bushes, giving them a start. At that point, the hiker has had enough and decides to book it. There's something nearby though, and it seems to be following quite closely. Eventually, the hiker makes it to the end of the trail and realizes that they have to go back where they came from. After the experience they had, they're not looking forward to it. In the end, they do indeed buck up and head back to the top of the trail. When they get to the part where they saw something dive into the bushes, they realize that it wasn't a monster or anything sinister, but in fact a little girl. She calls out for help, but as the hiker gets closer, a strange feeling washes over him. It looks like the girl is hurt and can't walk on her own, but when the hiker gets close enough for the little girl to see him, she begins screaming bloody murder. Oh no. It's at this point that the hiker gives up all pretenses and eats the girl taking her form. Bet you didn't see that one coming. Coming in at number 2, we've got the Moose Man. Let's take a quick trip to Alberta, except instead of seeing the mountains or hockey, we'll go looking for shape-shifting terrors. Hooray! There were tales circulating around for a while about some sort of centaur with moose features instead of horse ones, although many claim these to be patently false. That's not going to stop me from talking about it as if it were real though. This thing lived by the river and never got too close to human settlements. However, it would often kill and mutilate game animals to make them unusable. In fact, it's also said to have been involved in the killing and maiming of many men as well. Beyond the moose-centaur comparison, there isn't much to be said about the way this creature looks. It's huge, as all moose tend to be, and walks around with flesh hanging from its antlers. Like many creatures in the same vein, it reeks of something otherworldly and tends to make hideous noises when encountered. Whether the moose look is its only avatar or one of many forms, we may never know. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Roadrunner. Meep meep indeed. While walking his dog at around 10 p.m, our storyteller came across a couple dead rabbits accompanied by a horrid stench. Assuming it was just a fox or something, he moved right along. Soon after, his dog started acting super weird though. It wouldn't move at all and seemed to be staring at something off in the distance, eyes wide. Then the smell came back. This time he couldn't quite place where it was coming from, but he'd heard enough stories about bad smells and evil vibes in the woods to know to be careful. He took his dog and got off the path, hiding in some tall grass to the side. That's when he saw it. Something almost indescribable. Gray skin, rotten flesh, a horrible, emaciated horse's head, limbs that only seemed to half work. Made him want to run away at full speed immediately, but that was a bad call with it so close by. Sneaking seemed to be the better choice. The man and his dog started creeping away and got about 50 feet. The creature was out of sight now and the man thought he could start running. But apparently the Roadrunner knew exactly where he was trying to sneak away to and was immediately on his tail. Thankfully, the sneaking gave this man and his dog a bit of a head start and they were off to the races. As they ran from this awful beast, the man could hear it breathing. It sounded like an overexcited child, happy to be running in the woods in search of something good. Thankfully, getting back to the jagged gravel path proved to be a challenge for the Roadrunner. Whatever was wrong with its limbs made it difficult to traverse the rocky terrain, and eventually it gave up, screaming all the while. The man hasn't seen the creature again, but that's no guarantee that it's not around. Shapeshifting isn't uncommon with these kinds of things. Coming in at number 5, need more children. If anyone ever says this phrase to you, feel free to run away at speeds previously unknown to man, or knock them out. You have my full support. However, if the individual in question ends up being a Wendigo, then you're probably not going to have much luck with either of those tasks. They're just too strong and too spooky. And they get what they want most of the time, as evidenced by the story told by a now deleted Reddit user. I wonder how they're doing these days. I'll do my best to abridge this story for the sake of the length of today's video, so here we go. A man, his girlfriend, and their 3-year-old son all went out of town on a camping trip. At the behest of his superstitious partner, our storyteller packed the classic camping supplies, plus a shotgun, rifle, combat knife, and machete. When they reached their campsite, they noticed that the park rangers were kind of on edge and didn't seem to notice that they brought a whole pile of weapons. Odd. Onwards they trudged though and set up camp. That night they witnessed a horrible scene. It looked like someone had brutally killed a large animal, a buck perhaps, and dragged it away by the antlers. Not an easy task by any metric. Unnerved but resolute, they ate dinner and fed their son, then went to bed. In the middle of the night, a strange noise echoed throughout the woods, waking the man. He sat up and heard what sounded like muffled crying, prompting him to peek outside of the tent. What he saw he couldn't quite explain. It was like an enormous deer, slightly misshapen with enormous antlers and a strangely human presence about it. The man didn't need to see anything else. He pulled out his gun and shot it multiple times, causing it to bleed and shriek. It didn't die though, and before it disappeared into the night, it said the words, "Need more children." The man and his panicked wife then passed out. The panic didn't disappear the next morning either, as their son was not in the tent with them. They called the police, who arrived to investigate the blood left by the creature, and the man seemed to overhear them say something about it getting more bold. Unfortunately, their son was never found. Coming in at number 4, the Texas Wendigo. Traditionally, Wendigo are only found along the East Coast forests, around the Great Plains of the United States, and in the areas surrounding the Great Lakes. It's not often that you'll hear stories of them coming from other places, but parts of Texas are indeed located upon the Great Plains. And this Wendigo in particular made quite the name for itself in the area. From 2016 onwards, folks from the Yorktown, Texas area reported seeing a hulking figure almost 10 feet tall lurking around forested areas. It became such a common sight that a lot of people decided to avoid the woods altogether for a while. One intrepid explorer wanted to get a closer look at the thing, so he started frequenting the spots that it was most often sighted. During his search, he heard many noises characteristic of a Wendigo, the sounds of wounded or dying animals, human-like shrieks, and even basic sentences, all meant to entice him into the woods. Whoever this guy was knew the Wendigo's tricks though, and stayed well away from anywhere he'd be vulnerable. One evening, with plenty of mist still hanging in the air, he ran into the real deal. In an opening, he saw an old metal structure and 2 white houses, and between them a tall, lanky figure. It seemed to be spying on the inhabitants of these homes with devious intentions. He tried to ignore it as best he could as it walked along the path. Suddenly, a wave of overwhelming dread hit him and he got to running. Looking back behind him, he noticed that the Wendigo was now on all 4s, but still stood at around 5 feet tall. Thankfully, it didn't give chase, as the man theorizes that this was because the Wendigo was more interested in the housebound prey. To this day, he still thinks about its bone-white skin, bald head, dark black eyes, and humanoid face. He hasn't revisited the area. Coming in at number 3, we've got the frogs. Sometimes a story will draw you down one path and then pull out a twist so devious your spine will stay tingled for weeks. This is just such a tale. What do frogs have to do with the Wendigo? Well, just sit back and listen and I'll tell you a tale. This comes from Reddit user Unathana, who has a long history of listening to frogs make noise at night. When they were a kid, their grandmother would reassure them that the croaking was actually good as it kept the Wendigo away. Over time, they got used to the sounds and actually found them quite soothing. Flash forward many years and Unathana is enrolled in post-secondary education, taking a course on Native American literature. The Wendigo that they're learning about here is described a little differently than they remember their grandmother talking about. Frogs don't really do all that much to protect against such a creature. A damn shame. They then moved to a new place on the edge of town within a stone's throw of a pond just packed with frogs. The noise was once again comforting to them and they tended to keep their windows open to hear them and enjoy the balmy summer heat. However, the night they recounted this story, things were different. Gone was the heat as well as the sound of frogs. In fact, it was unseasonably cold and the night was quieter than ever. This did not bode well for Unathana, not one bit. Every passing second meant more dread, with nowhere to run or hide. The Wendigo is out there somewhere. Better watch out. Coming in at number 2, we've got Anansi's Goat Man. One of the best known Wendigo green text tales, the proliferation of spooky encounter stories on 4chan's paranormal board had a large impact on creepypasta culture in the early 2010s, usually told from a first-person perspective in bullet point form. Well, Anansi's tale starts as a green text, maybe to entice more readers to stick around, but soon becomes a more traditionally written story. It chronicles his trip out to Alabama to visit family and the very strange things that happened while in the rural landscape. He and some cousins went out to a little cabin/trailer in the woods and brought some neighbors and other local kids with them. At first, it was just a smell, something like copper or blood that washed over the area. Nobody could explain it, so they tried to ignore it. Then strange figures appeared in the trees making awful noises. Folks were freaked out, so they ditched the fire and went inside, which resulted in plenty of loud bangs at the door. Understandably, lots of people were scared and wanted to leave, but trekking back through the woods late at night with no weapons with all this going on seemed like a bad idea. They decided to stick it out till morning and then leave once whatever rednecks in the woods stopped messing with them. Soon they realized that there were 12 people in the cabin at some point, and now they were just down to 11. Uh-oh. So the next morning, some people left, but Anansi and his buddy Tanner stuck around with a few more folks. The copper smell came and left over and over again, and soon enough they realized that one of the people they were with was acting weird. She ran off slack-jawed into the woods and nobody saw her again. Tanner's cousin showed up later with a gun and claimed to have seen that girl gibbering alone in the woods. He tried to talk to her, but she didn't respond. Weird. On the last night everyone was at the cabin, somebody fired at the figure in the woods, causing it to scream and thrash for hours. During this time, everyone tried to get some sleep in the cabin while Tanner stood guard with the gun. Half asleep, he noticed someone come in from the bathroom and fall asleep on the floor. But that put their head count at higher than he remembered. It's a bad sign. Just to be safe, he continued to pretend to sleep in the guard chair and noticed that the new addition would convulse and thrash around from time to time. The next morning, everyone left except Tanner, who said he'd lock everything up. Checking the bathroom that the extra body came in from, he noticed that the bathroom window was wide open. Whatever this creature was, it was infiltrating their cabin and pretending to be another person the whole time. Horrifying. And finally at number 1 we've got the gun nut green text. We'll cap off this list with one more green text similar to Anansi's story but with a different twist. A group of friends from college decided to take a trip out to an uncle's cabin. The stench of blood and copper was just as prevalent here, and over time the strange events stacked up. The friends heard their own voices off in the woods, calling out for people to come find them. Dead animals were left all over the property, culminating in 2 halves of a deer being thrown at the side of the cabin. Thankfully, these pals were all a bunch of gun nuts with experience making homemade thermite, and when the going got bad, they got to work. Preparing to leave the cabin in the middle of the night, they had different roles for dealing with their Wendigo assailant. Some took point with rifles, while others packed their things. But at the last moment, after one pal went running off into the woods to see what he could find, they noticed something odd. A figure looking like their friend who had just run off was in the back of the cabin, appearing extra disheveled, pretending to pack up with the rest of them. This was their sign to open fire and toss one of their homebrew thermite grenades after it. Even then, they can't be sure that they actually put an end to whatever shape-shifting creature was stalking them. The cabin ended up as ash though, so they're not planning on visiting anytime soon. Coming in at number 5, we've got Jack Fiddler, Wendigo Hunter. And we'll kick this one off with not 1, not 2, but 14 purported Wendigo sightings. Possibly more if Jack wasn't able to get them before his untimely death. Back in the day, there was a man who claimed to be able to kill Wendigos. This man was known as Zauno Hishigo Galbo, but European settlers just knew him as Jack Fiddler. He lived in what's now known as the Sandy Lake First Nation and was a well-respected healer. He would go from community to community, ensuring the health of many people, but often he was sought out for more macabre business, fighting cannibalistic creatures. Jack would euthanize anyone who felt that the curse of the Wendigo was upon them. They sought him out to end their lives before they caused any trouble for their loved ones in their communities. Potions and ceremonies would mitigate damage, but death was the only surefire way to end a Wendigo's curse. And even then, it's a little tricky to deal with. So Jack would go from place to place, ensuring that Wendigos truly found their final resting place. After euthanizing the cursed individual, he would also perform a ritual cremation and burial to seal it away for good. Tales of his exploits eventually reached the Mounties though, who did not seem to think what Jack was doing was community service. After some investigation, they found out about a woman who was thought to be possessed. She was choked to death by her father-in-law and his brother. Any guesses as to who the brother was? Jack Fiddler. So the Fuzz arrested the men, claiming that what the law forbids, no pagan belief can justify. Jack eventually managed to slip away from the police before his trial and killed himself to avoid the long arm of the law. 14 counts of murder is a tough sentence, especially when assisted suicide and demon hunting were not considered valid defenses. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Wendigos of Blackwood Mountain. Boom. Butterfly effect. This pod of people eaters comes from the Choose Your Own Horrific Adventure game Until Dawn, featuring a pre-Bohemian Rhapsody Rami Malek. In this game, you make decisions that will end up sealing the fate of 8 unlucky vacationers. See, this group of pals decided to return to Blackwood Mountain a year after a tragic disappearance. They brought some friends up and pulled a nasty prank, resulting in one running off into the night. What the friends might not have known is that the area had been frequented by Wendigos for centuries. European miners came to the area back in the 1800s and were warned off by natives who claimed the mountain was sacred. As settlers tend to do, they ignored this advice and started excavating anyways. In doing so, they released the Wendigo spirits. Later on in the mid-1900s, a group of miners came back for some of those sweet, sweet minerals. They fell victim to some unfortunate accidents though and found themselves trapped in the mine shafts. Forced to cannibalize to survive, the remaining miners became Wendigos. After a powerful Wendigo was killed, its spirit was transferred to the unfortunate friend who ran off into the night. And you guessed it, this unfortunate individual came back with a vengeance. One by one, depending on how you play it, people fall victim to the Wendigo of Blackwood Mountain, sometimes becoming terrible creatures themselves. So next time you're in a survival situation, ask yourself if it's worth eating people and becoming a depraved monster in order to live. I'd take the long nap, to be honest. Coming in at number 3, we've got Pet Sematary. If you've only seen the movies based on this Stephen King tale, you might be a little confused. The feature films tend to skim over the folklore at the core of this resurrectory story. Sure, the ground is soured and stuff comes back to life, but why? Well, if you crack open a spicy little paperback, you'll find out exactly what happens. The spirit of a Wendigo plays a big part. The Creeds move into a lovely home near Ludlow and immediately run into trouble. The kids are getting hurt and the cat is killed by a passing vehicle. vehicle. And soon enough, they learn about the Micmac burial ground near their residence. Apparently, it was abandoned because the ground was sour. Soon they learn some tales detailing the Wendigo that lived around there. It would walk through villages late at night, and anyone touched by it would develop a taste for human flesh. Eventually, it touched the burial ground itself, souring it and causing anything buried there to be possessed by it. This Wendigo spirit seems to orchestrate all sorts of terrible events in the story, playing with the emotions of the people around the Creed house. Some say that the Wendigo even manipulates the grief of everyone in the tale, causing them to act against their better judgment. Through this, it can possess more people and cause more terror. The horror of the Wendigo runs deeper than just the hunger for flesh and physical strength. Coming in at number 2, we've got Wendigo psychosis. There is some debate as to whether this disorder is real or not. If you look to the origins of the Wendigo legend, you can find plenty of association with the depths of winter. Without readily available food, often First Nations people would be subjected to famine. One who would indulge in the taboo of human flesh was considered to be possessed by an evil spirit, one that would never be satisfied. It makes sense, right? The idea of a cautionary tale involving a slippery slope existing everywhere. One slip up and you can descend into the depths of depravity. This seemed to be where the Wendigo legend originates, and since then the Wendigo name has been used to denote a mental illness. Wendigo psychosis is said to be the uncontrollable craving for human flesh, even if other options are available. Often reported in the northeastern American tribes, it started to die out once folks began to study and write about it. This caused a lot of folks to become skeptical, but the idea lived on. Plenty of tales concerning this sudden cannibalism have turned up over the years, and whether an actual Wendigo spirit has possessed these individuals or if they're just experiencing a psychotic break is hard to say. There's an account from some Jesuit missionaries traveling through New France back in the 19th century where they came across some men with the mysterious psychosis. Keep in mind, these missionaries were likely deliberately painting any First Nations peoples as savages in need of religion, so maybe take this with a grain of salt. They claimed in their report that they met men so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men like veritable werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily the more they eat. I mean, that does sound like a Wendigo, doesn't it? And coming in at number 1, we've got Roadrunner. This is a man who claimed to have been possessed by a Wendigo. It seems that he was generally well liked in his community. A Cree man, he was a tour guide that assisted visitors. In the late 1870s, he and his family moved into the woods. Unseen from the winter of 1878 until the spring of 79, the man came back and claimed that his family succumbed to starvation during the harsh winter. He did not look worse for wear though. Suspicious of the supposedly starving man, folks went to find his campsite, and when they got there, they were horrified to discover human bones, picked clean and hollowed out. There was even a skull with a shoe in it. After this, Roadrunner admitted to cannibalizing his family. Didn't appear to be totally necessary either. There were posts nearby that they could have used to get supplies, and the option to return to the community was still on the table. The answer to whether a Wendigo spirit had actually overtaken him died with him though, as he was hanged for his transgressions. Cannibalism is scary enough on its own, but the idea of a Wendigo makes it that much worse.